A couple of days later, the owner called me and said, I have in fact received the first payment, which is 90% of the full amount, and then the other 10% is coming in a couple of days. And I absolutely couldn't believe it. Hello everybody. A couple of weeks ago I released a video titled The Scammer Who Offered Me £200,000 for the supercar I featured on my channel. You may have noticed that that video has now disappeared. But what happened next is even more bizarre. Let's start from the beginning. Imagine this, you open an email one morning and in it is an offer to buy a car for 30% above market value without asking for it to be inspected, without asking to see it in person, anything of that kind. What immediately springs to mind? Well, that of course it's a con of some kind. This is exactly what I thought when this very thing happened to me. Now it was slightly different because it was through YouTube and through a car that I featured on my channel. John, not his real name, from Melbourne, had seen the video, sent me an email saying, look, I'm happy to pay you this price for the car. On top of that, which was over the value of the car by a significant amount, but on top of that, I'm going to give you a £10,000 finder's fee to help me broker the sale. Just to be sure, I forward this email to a friend who lives in Melbourne who confirms to me that the address is non-existent. At least the postcode begins with the wrong number for a real address in Melbourne. So this just goes to completely confirm all my suspicions. So I could have just left things here at this point, but I decided to go along with it because perhaps this could be a useful video to make so that other people can see how these scams work. I even managed to get John on a Zoom call. I talked to him for about 25 minutes and in some ways, at least his accent is pretty convincing. He has some tall stories. He mentions that Jody Scheckter, for example, the ex-F1 champion, is dead and that he is buying his car. As I expected, he also couldn't get the video feed to work, so I could hear him, but I couldn't see him. But in any case, it in no way changes my opinion that this guy is a scammer. Part of what I wanted to find out is how this scam would work. So is he just harvesting information so that he can sort of clone identities or clone the car and try and sell the car without having it? Or is he actually after some of my money? During the call, we work out that he tells me the way this is going to work, he's going to send me a couple of contracts, one for me, for my fee, one for the seller, which I have to fill in. That will be with all my personal details, his personal details, the bank details, the VIN of the car, all that kind of stuff. So at that stage, I'm already starting to think perhaps it is just to harvest information. I send the contracts back with everything written on there, and then a series of weeks pass, and I'm not going to get into too much detail because it takes too long, but we exchange a lot of emails and things sort of seem to get stuck a little bit. I had included false details, but at no point did John come back to me and say, well, I've tried to transfer the money and the bank has come back to me and told me that the accounts are non-existent, which is exactly what would normally happen. Within a day or two, if not the moment really you try and make the transfer with most banks, they will tell you those details aren't right. Perhaps that person is giving you a wrong number. That never happened. There was a first transfer which was supposed to have taken place. And then when I said I still hadn't received anything, there were a few excuses made and John said that he was going to send the money now from a different account because the first one had some regulatory issues. I was convinced that what would happen is that at some point he would come back to me and say, look, the money is stuck somewhere here. You might have to pay a fee to release it. Or the other typical scam that happens is that you get a transfer above the market value or the agreed value in your bank. And at that point, the seller asks you to just send back the difference. Once you've done that, your bank comes back to you, the original amounts hadn't cleared, so you've ended up sending, a certain amount, thousands of pounds of your own money back to the scammer. And I was waiting for something along these lines to happen. It never did. I wanted to get John back on Zoom to confront him about what he was doing and why he was doing it. But after the second transfer, after a series of emails, a few emails back from John, it just all went quiet and I didn't hear from him again. At this stage, really, I would defy most people to say this is anything but a scam. Things though turned out to be a bit more complicated. I released the video and it started to do really well. Lots of comments from my friends, lots of comments from viewers, and some of my viewers in particular started to find out some interesting background information. I had completely assumed that the person I was dealing with simply made up all the details, like the name, the addresses, all that kind of stuff. Because the original address I thought was false, this person obviously didn't exist. But as more of you saw the video, especially from that area, you started to figure out that some of the things he was saying were in fact real. And after a while, I realized that the person he said he was a real person. And that really blew my mind because, of course, had I known that, I would never have used... I did take away a lot of the details on the video, but I did still leave his first name and his second name. So that was a bit shocking and a bit difficult to deal with. So just how did I miss that this was a real person? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, when I sent the address back to my friend and he said they don't exist with this postcode in this area, that just went to back up everything I thought. The problem was, it turned out later, this address was a real address, but it was a postal order box, and that's why my friend got confused, because it's not the normal address that you would have for a house in Melbourne. It's odd in itself that a PO box was provided, but anyway, that threw both of us, obviously, and then I didn't do as many searches as I would ordinarily. I did search for the name, but because it used a diminutive, so rather than John, say Jimmy, when I did the original Google search for that, nothing came up. Had I used the full name, I think some other things would have come up, but I really had no idea at this stage that this was a real person. The video was then taken down, and I prepared an edited version taking away more details, and at this stage, I was still convinced, and I think you would be too, that all the scammer had done was just taken the identity of someone else and he was passing himself on as the real John, whatever it is, from Melbourne. But this is where it just got really strange, and that is, I started talking to more people in the Pantera world, De Tomaso world. I've got good connections there. There's a lot of really good people. They've been great to me and the channel. And more information started coming up that this person, or whoever was pretending to be John, firstly, he'd posted in some of the forums. Secondly, he had done something similar in Australia already with somebody. He'd gone through this process of wanting to buy a car. And thirdly, and most alarming of all, the owner of the Pantera that I'm talking about that I featured got in touch and said, you know, this guy, he's the real guy. He is who he says he is because he's contacted the Pantera Club in the UK. The owner of the car contacted the law firm that John said he was linked to and got confirmation that although he wasn't really linked to the law firm, he was who he said he was and his family was linked to it. So at that stage, I felt like a complete moron, I have to be honest. And John apparently was then dealing directly with the owner, and it looked likely that the purchase was going to go through. Now, it's not, you know, the potential £10,000 I could have gained out of it. I didn't really care about that. It was more that, as mentioned, I have a good relationship with the Pantera owners, and this didn't really put me in a very good light. I thought, how could this happen? I really defy anyone not to think that this was a scam or too good to be true. But the story doesn't end here. So of course I'm not going to re-release my original video where I made a glaring mistake, and that is to say that this guy doesn't exist and he is a scammer. It turns out he very much does exist, and certainly it doesn't look like he was out to get any money out of me or the owner. So now all that is left is just to hear what is now happening with the sale of this car. The owner goes through a similar process to mine, so he communicates with John. John writes in the same way he did to me, so quite bombastic, quite long emails, rambling stuff. He signs an invoice that is then sent to John with all his details. A couple of days later, the owner called me and said, I have in fact received the first payment, which is 90% of the full amount, and then the other 10% is coming in a couple of days. And I absolutely couldn't believe it. I can't tell you how I felt on that news. It did turn out though that he was just being a cheeky sod and no money had come through, and he kept me going for a few seconds, but I can tell you that was long enough. The pattern continued as it had previously, it seems, which is that there was excuses made, the money will turn up on this date, didn't turn up. Then there was an issue with the payment, so it will turn up on this date, didn't turn up. And I think quite sensibly, the owner of the car decided that he was going to stop chasing John. So, what to make of all this? It's been a real roller coaster ride for me because John isn't a scammer. He's certainly a time waster. Perhaps he likes to think that, you know, he's owning the car. I don't know what's going through his mind. I certainly don't wish him any ill feelings. But having said that, ultimately, I think that one of the takeaways from this is that when things look too good to be true and someone is offering you way above market price for your car, he isn't asking any questions, he isn't asking to have it inspected or seen, he's offering you a lot of money to do very little, then usually it is too good to be true, as in this case. What I have also learned is to do more research. What really threw me is simply that at the very beginning, it was confirmed to me the address was wrong, and along with all the other stuff, you know, it just seemed like an archetypal con. So in the end then, the Pantera wasn't sold, and it seems that John has a bit of a pattern and a history of dealing with Pantera owners, perhaps owners of other cars as well, and not following through with the purchase, but I'm sure there's no intentional malice involved in that, although perhaps it's a bit frustrating for the owners who deal with him. I thought it was important that I follow up on the original video now that I had more information, and I still hope it can be useful for those who may get approached by a real scammer to know some of the techniques that they would use and how they would use them. Thank you all so much for watching. This one has been a real adventure for me. Had a few ups and downs with it, but ultimately I'm glad I've told you the story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really look forward to seeing you for the next video.